Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will continue to work on our live search results JavaScript. To be more specific, when someone opens up the overlay and actually begins typing into this input field, we want to respond to that event of them typing, but as we discussed in our previous lesson, we don't want to send a search request off to the WordPress server the millisecond someone types in a letter here. Right? So for example, if someone was going to search for math, well, when they very first press the M key, we want our JavaScript to wait a second, right? We don't actually want to search the WordPress database for M. So what we're going to do is every time a user types a letter in here, we can begin a countdown or a timer, maybe to 800 milliseconds or 3/4 of a second. And then as soon as they type in another letter, we can reset that clock so the countdown starts over again. And then once they finally finish typing whatever it is they're typing and they pause for a split second, then at that moment we can use our JavaScript to send off this search request to the WordPress server. And then we can display the results right here, right? So any programs or professors, campuses, or events that have to do with math. But first things first. Before we worry about managing time in JavaScript, let's first begin by just responding to this event at all, right? The event of a key being pressed on a keyboard while this text field is focused. So right now, let's get started by jumping into our text editor. And in our theme folder, let's go into the JavaScript folder and then modules. And let's open up search.js. And if we want to be on the lookout for an event, we can just write a new bit of code within our events section. Right? Each one of these lines represents a different event that we're on the lookout for. So why don't we just add a new line, and we can look to the line right above it for inspiration. Right? Because the event of pressing down a key on your keyboard is still the event that we are looking for this time around. But the big difference here is the element that we want to attach this event listener to. In this line of code, we chose the page as a whole, or the document object. So no matter where you are on the page or what you've clicked on or given focus to, the keydown event will still be registered. Well, in this new line of code that we're going to write, we don't want to target the page as a whole. Instead, we want to target just this one text field element that users can type into. We want to add the keydown event listener to this specific single element. So we can begin this line of code by using jQuery to select that element. I can't remember the class or ID of that element off the top of my head, but if we jump into our footer.php file and scroll down to the very bottom, remember this is where we wrote that little bit of search overlay HTML. So here's the input element, the text field, and you'll see that we gave it an ID of search-term. So back in our JavaScript, we can select that element by saying hashtag to look for an ID and then just type it out, search-term. Okay, so now that we've got that one element, we can just use the jQuery on method. So this takes two arguments. The first is the name of the event. So instead of click, we're going to use key down again. And then the second argument is a function that you want to run in response. So the name of this function does not matter. We get to make a name up. We're actually just going to call one of our methods. So before we make up a name here, down in the methods section, why don't we create a brand new method where we make up a name? We could call it whatever we want, but why don't we call it typing logic? Right? Because this method is going to contain all of our logic for waiting 800 milliseconds before continuing on. Okay, so we will build out this method a bit later on, but back up here on this new event line, for the second argument, now we can just point towards that new method. So this to look inside our object, and then dot, and then the name of that method, so typing logic. Now before we save this and test it out in the browser, let's do a couple of things. So first, instead of selecting the search field element right here with jQuery, why don't we instead select the element up in our constructor and create a property just like we did for the open button and the close button and the overlay div itself, right? Let's do that same thing for the search field element. My reasoning for wanting to do that is I know that we are going to need to access this element again and again. And remember that accessing the DOM, the web browser's document object model, is very slow compared to the lightning fast speed of JavaScript reading its own properties. So what I'm proposing is up here in the constructor, you could add a new line right below this at the very bottom, or to stay organized and keep all of the elements near each other, you could add a new line here. And let's create a new property. So this dot, and we could name it whatever we want. Why don't we call it search field, and then just set it to equal this jQuery selector that we already wrote. So I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard, and then in its place have X as a temporary placeholder. And then up in the constructor, set this new property to equal, paste in our clipboard, add a semicolon at the end. Cool, so now down here, instead of the temporary placeholder X, we can just reference this property. So we can just say this dot search field, and then we can call the on method on that property. So this way we have this reusable variable that points towards that element, instead of us needing to touch the DOM again and again and again, which can be slow. Cool. Now before we save this, one last thing I want to do is inside our typing logic method, why don't we add just a quick test? So we can alert maybe just a pop-up message that says, hello from typing logic. Right? Just so we can test things out and make sure that it's working. So at this point, let's go ahead and save this. And make sure that you have gulp watch running in the command line, right? So your JavaScript will get rebundled up. And then let's go over to the browser and test this. So open up the overlay, and as soon as I start typing in a letter, cool, we see that annoying alert message, hello from typing logic. So that means our code is working properly. Now let's learn how to manage and work with time in JavaScript, right? Because we don't actually want to do something the millisecond a key is pressed down on that text field. So within our typing logic method, let's delete this alert test line. And instead, I want to show you how we can wait a little while in JavaScript before doing something. So just as an extreme example, let's imagine we wanted to wait a full 2 seconds after the event happens and this method runs. So within the method, we can use something in JavaScript called setTimeout. SetTimeout takes 2 arguments. The first argument is a function that you want to run. I'm just going to say X as a temporary placeholder. And then the second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before running that function. So if we wanted to wait 2 seconds, that's 2,000 in terms of milliseconds. Now back to the function that we want to run after this amount of time has passed. You're free to type out the name of a function here, right? A function that has been defined somewhere else, like one of our methods. Or you can always just create an anonymous function right in place here. So to create an anonymous function, we can delete that temporary placeholder, and you just type out the word function, and then parentheses, and then curly brackets. Right? So instead of including the name of a function that points somewhere else, you could just create a function right in place. And then within the curly brackets, let's log out a message to the console as a test. So we could say console.log, and for the message we could say, this is a timeout test. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And now back in the browser, I'm going to open up the JavaScript console so I can see if that test message is coming through. So click onto console, and I'm going to resize my main browser window so I can see the console window at the same time. Cool. Okay, so let me open up the search overlay. Remember, we still have those open and close test messages from our previous lesson whenever you open or close the overlay. But as soon as I click onto the text field and press a letter on my keyboard, you'll notice that nothing happens immediately. Instead, the browser waits a full 2 seconds, and then it shows us this test message. So cool, that means our setTimeout is working as intended. However, let's not forget the entire reason we wanted to add a pause or a timer in the first place. Remember, we didn't want to flood the WordPress server with random or short meaningless search strings. So pretend that where we are logging this test message out to the console, pretend that this is where we are actually going to send a request to the WordPress server. Now what I mean by this is if I just press one letter, right? So if I type in the letter A now, we see the number 2 here to signify that that has been ran twice. And if I type in another letter, we see this goes up to 3, right? Because this is ran 3 times. However, watch what happens even if I type very rapidly like you would normally do. So if I come to the website and search for biology, whoa, we see that it climbs all the way to 12. And this is because at the moment, the way our code is set up, every time we press a key, it's going to fire this method, and each time that's going to create a new unique timeout, right? Each one of those timers with each key press is its own entity. So if I go back and refresh the page and open up the search, if I type in biology, that will take me 7 keystrokes, right? And there we see 7. And this is not what we truly want. We wouldn't want to send 7 different requests to the WordPress server. Or in other words, we don't want to create 7 different timers or 7 different timeouts that are all independent of each other. Instead, why don't we work with just one single timeout, and then we can clear or reset that timer each time this method runs. So let me show you what I mean. Instead of just having this set timeout floating in outer space, what we can do up in our constructor is create a new property. So we just say this dot, and then we can make up whatever name we want. Why don't we go with typing timer? And we don't even need to set it to equal a value. We can literally just declare this as a property. And now down in our typing logic method, instead of creating an unnamed set timeout that's just sort of floating in outer space, why don't we say this dot typing timer equals a set timeout? This way we are giving this timeout or timer a name that we can access, right? We are assigning it to this property or variable. Now check this out. Right above this line, still within the typing logic method, we can use another tool in JavaScript named clear timeout. And this is how you can reset a timeout or timer. So now within the parentheses for clear timeout, we can just use the name of our property, this dot typing timer. So this way, every time we press a key while we are in that search field, we know that this method is going to run, and the first thing we do is clear or reset the timer. So for example, maybe it had been 1.5 seconds since the last time we had pressed down a key. So that would mean that there was only 500 milliseconds left on this countdown of 2000. So this way we are resetting that, or I should say we are basically getting rid of that timeout or timer. The timer that was going to expire or execute in 500 milliseconds, we are saying, nope, forget about it. Okay, and then right after that, we are just reestablishing a timeout that will execute this code in 2000 milliseconds from now. Cool, now before we save this and test it out in the browser, we do need to talk a little bit about the keyword this. Right, because the this keyword is what's allowing us to reference this variable that lives within our constructor, or I should say this property that lives within our constructor. So down within our typing logic method, in order to access the properties and methods of this object, we are counting on the this keyword pointing towards our object. However, remember this function is being called by this event handler, and by default the on method is going to set the value of the this keyword to equal whatever element triggered the event. So in this case, at this very moment, within this method, the this keyword is pointing towards the main text input field instead of our object. Now to fix this, that's why we've been using .bind this on all of our function calls. So for this search field keydown event, when we call this method, let's just be sure to add on .bind this. Cool, now at this point, let's save this and take our clear timeout reset functionality for a spin. What we are hoping to see is that this code will not be executed for every single key press. Instead, only when someone has truly waited 2000 milliseconds in between key presses would we hope to see this code. So back in the browser, let's open up the search overlay. And if I start typing in biology at just a regular typing speed, perfect. Our code waited until there was a 2-second gap after a keystroke, and then our code ran only once. And that's exactly what we want. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will continue working towards being able to pull in real data from the WordPress database. So instead of this test message, we will send a request to WordPress, and then we will even display the results right here for the visitor. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.